to your flipped classroom in our continuing discussion of the Protestant Reformation in England, right? We are talking about the Protestant Reformation underneath this guy right here, Henry VIII. That's one of his other advisors that he had executed. That's Sir Thomas Cromwell, that guy showed the picture of Anacletus to him, was like, what do you think about this girl from the Holy Roman Empire, right? But the big thing about it, though, okay, when we left off in class talking about how basically the church that Henry VIII created was just a diet version of the Catholic Church, right? We were basically just talking about how the Anglican Church retained most of its Catholic qualities and stuff like that, which demonstrates to us ultimately that this was a giant political move, right? I really appreciate you bringing me lamb chop. I do, okay? I appreciate it, but I need you to go over there. All right, so now look, but the big thing about it, though, okay, is it does retain all those things. It does still have celibate priests and stuff like that, and transubstantiation and confession, and even also in the modern era, Anglican priests still wear the collar and still look very much like a Catholic priest in their garb, right? But they are not celibate anymore and stuff like that, and we'll get to all that stuff here in a minute. But what we are going to start noticing, though, is that later, however, Henry is going to begin changing elements of the church to best suit his needs, right? For example, he is going to dissolve English monasteries, right? Now, for example, or just not for example, so what you need to understand, though, what a monastery is, right? A monastery, of course, is like a convent or a monastery or a place where nuns and, like, monks dedicate their lives to the religion or to the Catholic religion and to its study as well. They translate works, they do a lot of thinking, they're basically theologians and stuff like that. But Henry basically saw this as a big thing, being like, well, do we need monasteries anymore in the Anglican Church? I don't think so. And he dissolves all of them in the pursuit of funds, right? And he actually encloses a lot of that land and turns it into farmland and sells it and makes a lot of money off of it, right? And this helps finance a lot of his other projects, and eventually also it ends up actually financing the royal seal as well and the bank accounts of the royals and stuff like that. But ultimately what we need to understand is that obviously Henry has some political motives behind this church, right? Anglican priests are going to be allowed to marry in 1549, about 2 years after Henry VIII actually dies, because he dies, I believe, in 1547. I gotta look that date up, though, okay? But I'm pretty sure about that. But the other big one that's going to end up going down is the Third Succession Act of 1543, all right? Now, this one has nothing to do with the church, okay? But it does just kind of actually demonstrate a couple of things to us about his political value, right? Now, what he does is he passes an act through Parliament called the Third Succession Act of 1543, which will actually create a system wherein Edward, his son, will get the throne first, and then the throne, to avoid a major civil war, will pass to his daughters should it need to, right? Now, Henry, in the back of his mind, was thinking to himself that Edward will probably get married, he'll probably have kids, and it'll negate Mary and Elizabeth from the throne anyway, right? But he wanted to make sure to avoid a large-scale civil war because, something that y'all don't realize, actually, which is totally okay, but to give you some prior background, the Tudor family, the only reason that they were actually in power in England is because of the outcome of this really big civil war that broke out in England called the War of the Roses, right? And the War of the Roses was actually coming about after the death of the Plantagenet dynasty, and they actually were basically, in essence, like they didn't know who the throne was going to go to, right? And when they didn't know who the throne was going to go to, two competing noble factions fought against each other for the pursuit of the crown, right? It was the Yorks and the Lancasters, right? And they were known as the War of the Roses because they each had roses in their royal seals, right? Or in the seals of their families. One had a white rose, one had a red rose, right? And so it was known as the War of the Roses. But the thing about going into it, though, is to avoid another major large-scale civil war like that, where he was only the second Tudor ruler so far, he passes that Third Succession Act to make sure that the family keeps getting the royal house, right? To make sure that the Tudors stay in power. Now, he does end up dying, actually, from a massive infection in his ulcery leg, mostly due to the fact of a joust wound and stuff like that he got when he was younger. But going into it, you have to understand is that Henry VIII will eventually die, and that the rulership does pass to Edward VI, his son, who only ruled for about 6-ish years. More like 2 if you count all the times that he was ill, right? Now, there's some interesting little fun facts about him, right? He almost married a 7-month-old that we'll talk about her in a couple of minutes. He tried to give the throne to Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, when he knew he was going to die, which actually didn't go too well and ended up going to his sister anyway. But a big thing about it that he does end up actually creating is a thing called the Book of Common Prayer, right? Now, the Book of Common Prayer was basically the how-to guide for Anglican masses, right? And how they were supposed to look a little bit different from Catholic ones and stuff like that, how they were supposed to use different altars and how services were supposed to actually be created and how they were actually supposed to function, right? Now, interesting little thing about Edward, though, is like I just said, he did not live for very long, right? Because he actually ended up dying from an illness, and after trying to give the throne to his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who only was actually in power for 9 days, right? It actually ended up passing to his sister, Mary, and she's going to be the one that legally gets the throne, right? Now, this is where things get interesting in our whole Protestant Reformation guise and guide and understanding of all this stuff, is that after it goes to his sister, Mary, which was also a very short reign. She only lived for about 5 years in power, and then she died as well, right? Her reign was very, very short, but what she's going to end up doing is she pulls England back to Catholicism, right? She actually reinstates the Catholic Church as the official church of England, and in this process, she also marries a Catholic monarch, right? A man by the name of Philip II, right? You should know this name immediately, right? Philip II is the son of Charles V, right? Charles V, the guy that split his family in half and stuff like that into the Austrian and Spanish branch. Philip II was his son that was in charge of the Spanish branch, right? And the reason why he ended up marrying her is because he was a Catholic king of Spain. And in his mind, if they could have children, that would actually make it so a Habsburg ruler would be in charge of the kingdom of England eventually, right? That if they could have kids, right, that their royal seed or whatever would end up ruling not only Spain, but of England as well, right? So this is empire building we're looking at, right? Now, big thing about it, though, she was very bad at being Bloody Mary, which was her nickname and stuff like that, because she actually, whenever she would catch Protestants still being Anglican or catch anyone, like, rebelling against, like, the new, like, Catholicism that she brought in, she would actually have people burned at the stake, but only about 300 of them were burned at the stake. And I think that, it's pretty aggressive to call her Bloody Mary if she only killed, like, a few hundred people. But what is going to end up happening, though, is under her reign, 1,000 of them are going to flee. Now, where they end up going is a very interesting little dynamic in our story. A lot of them flee to Switzerland, right? And what guy lives in Switzerland? I hope Miley's screaming it right now. That's right, John Calvin lives in Switzerland, right? And his Genevan consistory is still the one running shop there. So a bunch of Anglicans who were Anglican, right, run away to like learn how to be a Calvinist from John Calvin's community firsthand, right? And the thing about it is that Bloody Mary will die, and then when her sister Elizabeth comes to power, she's now going to have to deal with this whole problem because she brings England back to Anglicanism, right? Now, her biggest incoming problem is these people called the Puritans, right? Those are the people that fled Mary, right? When they fled to Switzerland and then came back, Calvinists, right? The Puritans wanted the Anglican Church to purify itself of all of its Catholic elements, right? Basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to get rid of the Eucharist the way it was done. They wanted to get rid of anything in church ceremonies that smelt of Catholicism, right? And they wanted all that stuff to get thrown out the window, right? Well, that's why they were called Puritans, because they wanted to purify the church, right? But the interesting little dynamic about this whole thing is that their sect will grow very quickly, and they cause a lot of problems for not the Tudors, but the Stuarts, who will come up later, right? And also, our other big problem is going to be Catholics in general, because you're going to have a lot of people that were secretly Catholic and stuff like that underneath the reign that are actually going against this whole thing. But what she decides to do in this moment is she begins to be a very large political pragmatist, right? And she begins to separate herself from the church a little bit, right? The Act of Supremacy that was passed by her father in 1534 is actually going to be changed a little bit, and instead of being the supreme head of the church anymore, she actually turned it over to the archbishops, particularly the Archbishop of Canterbury, and she decided to actually become more of the governor of the church, right? Basically the facet, the installed ruler, the power, the queen anointed by the church, rather than being the head of the church in and of itself, right? So she could focus on the political factors of England rather than focusing on the actual the church power aspects of things, right? Now, this is going to upset a lot of Catholics because they're going to see it solidify her rule, right? And this right here is Elizabeth herself, exactly like what Kylie said in class, very, very white-faced, all the red hair. She actually wore a lot of white makeup because of all the smallpox scars she had on her face and stuff like that. But her cousin was going to present a little bit of an issue for her, right? Her cousin was the Queen of Scotland, right? And it was a devout Catholic, okay? Now, she ends up creating some problems for her because there's some ideas of potential overthrow, right? So Mary Queen of Scots is her name, and some of y'all have probably heard of her before, right? Mary Queen of Scots is a very, very famous figure. If any of you have ever seen the show Reign, right, spelled R-E-I-G-N, it focuses on Mary Queen of Scots and Catherine de' Medici, right? Now, Mary Queen of Scots, though, as the Catholic ruler of Scotland, actually almost allies with Mary's former husband, right? So Mary's former husband, right? Mary, because Guy, Philip II, right? He actually tried to marry Elizabeth. And Elizabeth said no. And she was like, I'm not marrying anybody, right? I want to be with Robert Dudley, and he won't be with me. But anyway, now the big thing about it, though, in the long run, is that basically what ends up happening is this creates a rift between the two of them, right? And then Philip starts trying to create an alliance with Mary, Queen of Scots, the Scottish cousin of Elizabeth. And by the way, for those of you who don't know your map of Europe very well, Scotland is in the northern area of the same island that England is on, right? So this would present a huge problem for Elizabeth. So what Elizabeth decides to do is she allies with the Dutch, who are currently revolting against Philip and trying to create their own country, right? They're basically revolting against him. They don't want to be the Spanish Netherlands anymore. They just want to be the Netherlands, right? And so she ends up allying with them, creating a huge rift between the two of them, right? And actually it leads to a very large war, right? Philip II versus Elizabeth I. Not really a war in and of itself, but a warlike act, right? It's this very, very big event in 1588 known as the Spanish Armada, right? So what ends up happening, though, is Philip actually supports Mary, Queen of Scots, but what ends up happening in the long run, long story short, Elizabeth has Mary, Queen of Scots executed. I'll tell you about why and stuff like that in class because I want to over-confuse you and I don't want you to write too much in your flip and stuff like that about this thing because it's not that important in that aspect. But the Spanish Armada is going to be a really, really big moment because a Catholic ruler of Spain is about to go one-on-one with a Protestant ruler of England, right? And the Spanish Armada is a huge event where Philip II took a major gamble and lost. In 1588, the matchup was, okay, several hundred Spanish galleons versus a handful of English trade vessels, right? And English naval fleets, okay? As you can see right here, these Spanish galleons are massive, right? Very, very large, huge cannon ships, and they outnumbered the English ships almost 2-1, okay? But what ended up happening, though, is England ends up winning this major fight. Reason why? Fire ships is a big one, and we'll talk about that in class and stuff like that. But basically, the English set boats on fire and, shoved it at the, Spanish. Also, storms on the backside of Ireland killed a major number of the Spanish vessels, and also, a lot of their food and water went bad, so they couldn't really have the capacity to fight anymore. But what's going to end up going down of this, though, the results are, is that basically, the Protestant cause looks amazing, right? Because a lot of people are resulting the political aspects of what's going on at the time to what God prophesizes and stuff like that. So it appears as though God came down on the side of Elizabeth, and she ended up winning. And she became a very, very strong ruler. And she solidified herself as the Queen of England even further, right? And so the thing about it, though, is that this is going to basically look like a Protestant ruler has now upset a Catholic one, right? Now, we'll talk about all that stuff a little bit more. We'll elaborate on it a little bit more in class. But the Reformation also, how does it affect the rest of Europe, right? Because we've been talking about the Reformation for the most part. It's been taking place in Italy, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and England now. But if we look at this, western area of Europe, it's still mostly Catholic. All this green is Catholic. Any other color is a new type of, Protestant, Protestant religion that's popping up. As you can see, as you head towards Eastern Europe, it basically turns into a little bit of a melting pot, and the Reformation itself actually looks a little bit more spread out, right? You've literally got Eastern Orthodox over there, Anabaptists are still floating around out here a little bit in what is now modern-day Poland. You've got, literally Anglicans in England, and then Calvinists popping up a little bit everywhere, but basically just know that it's spreading also out to Eastern Europe, but Eastern Europe's a very large melting pot and kind of a mishmash of this entire thing. But then what's going to happen in 1545 is this thing known as the Catholic Counter-Reformation. But what I'm going to do really quick is I'm going to slip in a clip of a flip that I actually reported a couple years ago that's very, very good at explaining this, but I'm going to let that guy do it, Mr. Terry from 2 years ago. He's going to explain it to you. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. Now, are the Catholic Church officials going to respond to all this stuff? Of course they are. They have to, right? They absolutely have to respond to all this stuff. And so they lead what is known as the Counter-Reformation, right? Let's double check on our time, where we're going and where we're getting to, right? And then... All right, nice. We can definitely cover this stuff later on. But still, let's go ahead and go over this real fast, okay? So the Catholic Reformation is going to pop up, and this is going to be called the Counter-Reformation, right? The Catholic Church realizes, under some subsequent popes who come up during the Protestant Reformation, that we've got a real problem. We have a problem because our faith is running people away, right? We have an issue because we've got Luther in Holy Roman Empire, who's now long dead, but still, he's causing us issues, right? We've got Henry in England. We got Calvin in Switzerland. And they're really destroying not only their money that's coming in, but also the solidarity of the Catholic faith, right? Then arrives Pope Paul III, right? Pope Paul III shows up, and he is going to encourage the Counter-Reformation. He encourages the Catholic faith to look internally, to look at themselves, and really kind of step back and be like, wow, we are the ones causing this. We are the ones creating this because of all the things that we've kind of done negative this entire time, right? And he's going to separate himself from these Renaissance popes that came before him because he encourages reform. He discouraged the buildings of new churches, discouraged this idea of putting $1 million fresco on the ceiling of every single one of them, discouraged the idea of continually adding things to the Vatican City to just make them look more grandiose, right? So he supports the reforms of education to make sure that priests are being formally trained. He also supports stricter clerical life. No more pluralism, no more priests getting into the priesthood or noble families putting their kids in the priesthood because they know it's going to be an easy job where they're going to make a lot of money, right? He said that no, clerical life should be again about those Benedictine rules of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the church. He believes in purging and cleansing the Catholic faith and giving you the Catholic faith that exists now, the post-Reformation Catholic faith, right? And he establishes the holy office of the Roman Catholic Agency to combat doctrinal heresy, right? Which is a really, really big thing that I don't like about it. All right, so anyway, now this is the one thing I don't like about Paul, all right? Pope Paul III did establish this concept of the Roman Catholic Agency to combat doctrinal heresy, where he basically creates a list of books that are banned for all Catholic people to read, right? The Praise of Folly by Erasmus ends up on it. Utopia by Sir Thomas More ends up on it. Pica Mirandola's 900 Theses ends up on it. Several other Calvinists writer of the Institutes of Christian Religion ends up on there. Writings of Luther end up on this list of banned books. I don't like that about Paul because he's not allowing them to read and decide on their own because he's still encouraging masses in Latin. He's still encouraging Bibles only being written in Latin. He's not encouraging the list of vernacular things. But I do like how he is trying to fix things. Not every religious figure or every single historical figure is going to be perfect, right? Paul III did a lot of good stuff. Education reform, reform of the church, stop building up all these nice things. We are not here to make money, but then he's also like, but I don't want you reading stuff. I don't like that, right? But he is still a very all-important figure, right? And he also kind of kept the Inquisition around. So the Inquisition, of course, being the church court to try people who are heretics and possibly see them burned at the stake, right? Now, however, he did speak out against a lot of the death sentences and things like that. And he was saying that we need to kind of tamp that down a little bit. And he also encouraged the Catholic Church to be the leaders of the Inquisition instead of the Spanish Inquisition that happened over in Spain where they were like, are you sure you're not Jewish anymore? Let me see you eat this bacon. And all this other crazy stuff, right? But the big place he does this at is the Council of Trent, right? Which is a several times meeting idea. And as you can see, he was doing this when Calvin was still active and alive. Was he alive still? I don't think he was alive, actually. I think he died in 64, yeah. All right, so yeah, he was still alive. During his lifespan, during the lifespan of John Calvin, the Council of Trent begins to meet. And the Council of Trent has major successes where they discuss all these things that Pope Paul once reformed, right? From 1545 to 1563, they meet multiple times. And it's these huge meetings of cardinals and the Pope discussing the issues raised by these reformers, right? Some major successes, they outlaw the sale of indulgences, right? That's huge. Not necessarily the biblical indulgences. They don't say that you can't do good deeds and also take some time off your purgatory, but they outlaw the sale of indulgences. So make the sale of indulgences illegal. They reject the which stinks. They do this, and I don't they do this, and it drives me nuts. They reject the salvation by faith idea, which is a Lutheran concept, because by being in your faith, you know what I mean, you can then also go to heaven. So they still retain the sacraments list, which is a little annoying, personally. Well, actually, that's not true. It's something that, it's just different. It's not annoying, it's just different. I was just raised Protestant. It's just different. I respect it. I get it. Now, anyway, but they're also going to acknowledge corruption of the clergy, right? They're going to acknowledge that some of these clergy members are having illegitimate kids. They're going to acknowledge the idea that, some of these clergy members need to be brought up on reform. So they're actually trying to work to fix that and use the Inquisition to even hunt down their own clergy that are violating these rules. They're going to begin to bring women in as well to help educate children, right? They're going to help get women to create some of the first Catholic schools, right? No. like to actually create, like the nuns and the sisters would be brought in to help educate children in the ways of the Catholic Church, right? They're also going to create new orders, right? And the new orders are going to be very important. We're going to talk about those. Put a little star next to those new orders, right? We're going to talk about 2 of them, okay? Now, they are going to have some failures, though, too. They did not attempt to reconcile with Lutherans, which really stinks. They kind of just said, well, Lutherans will be Lutherans, right? And Lutherans are going to be over there. And if any Catholic country like acknowledges or accepts Lutheranism, then they themselves are sinning. And so he could have done a little bit better about that. And the Council of Trent could have done a little bit better about that. But he also like just only acknowledged their existence, which is really annoying. Same thing with the Calvinists too, right? Acknowledge that they're just there, right? And some of these new orders are going to pop up, though. We're going to see new orders of priests, right? Because you've had some priests that have existed since the Middle Ages, right? Franciscans, Benedictine monks, like all these other groups of people. But the big goal of these new orders is going to harp on the education of priests and people, right? To spread the faith using education, right? Teach them mathematics and about Christ, all right? So, like, this is a big deal. And one of the biggest ones that was created was the Ursuline Order of Nuns, right? Which is, of course, what Ursuline Academy is named after. I know some of you are like, ugh, but still, all right, it's very, very important. The Ursuline nuns were an order of nuns founded by Angela Merici, not Medici, but Merici, which concentrated on the education of young women to raise the collective intelligence of a household. Christine de Pizan and Isabella d'Este would be so proud by this. They're basically trying to harp on the idea of educating young women to have smart women. If you have smart women who make smart mothers make smarter children, right? Smarter children make better attributes to the Catholic faith, right? So the Ursuline nuns are going to be a major one, but this is the biggest one. The Society of the Jesuits. Again, what Jesuit high school is named after. Founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola, right? St. Ignatius of Loyola encourages education above all things, right? Helps spread Christianity and humanist thought, like actual Renaissance ideas, right? To place it, and the Jesuits take it upon themselves to spread the Catholic faith and education to places like Japan, India, Brazil, North America, the Congo. They spread faith and intelligence all over the place, right? And where did this all come from? Because St. Ignatius of Loyola himself was a former soldier, actually. He was actually a soldier before he actually entered into the priesthood. And while he was a soldier, he had actually been wounded in battle, right? And since he was stuck inside of a cast and on a bed for so long, he was like, you know what? I've got to figure out, I can't exercise my body right now, so what I'll do is I'll exercise my faith, right? And he would read a certain number of Psalms every day. He would read a certain number of, like, Latin, what do they call, parables every single, not a parable, I don't know. There's a psalm, there's other things. All right, so he would read a bunch of those every day. Verses, all right, so he would read a certain number of verses every day as like his exercise program, right? And I'm going to do 30 flexes, and I'm going to read 30 verses, and I'm going to do 30 push-ups, and I'm going to read 30 Psalms, right? It's a very bro-y kind of thing. And big thing about it, why they're so important, is your boy Francis himself is a Jesuit, right? So like a Jesuit monk, all right? So the big thing about it is these orders still exist, and they still permeate our society, and they are products of the Counter-Reformation. And with our bad boy Francis, I will literally tell you straight up, I love this guy. I think he's awesome. I imagine he drives a white Harley all the time and just like throwing holy water bombs at people because the man, I actually saw him in Philadelphia. He's a really good guy. Very, very big fan of the Pope. But anyway, so on that note, I'll talk to you guys later. Y'all have a good one.